We're going to be doing a lot of neat labs and activities over the course of our year together, but of course, it's important that we know what it is that we're using to conduct those labs appropriately. So let's take a minute and go and look at some of those equipment pieces in the lab. So let's start by taking a look at some of the glassware that we will often be using in class. There's a couple of these I bet you're very familiar with, but then there's also some that I imagine are going to be a little bit new. Top-down shot here just to kind of give you a better look of these different pieces as we're going. Hopefully we recognize this one straight off the bat. That is a test tube. We use that often for looking at different reactions in an enclosed space. We've got our beakers for making up solutions or mixtures. We mix our substances in these, not in the graduated cylinders. Graduated cylinders so-called because they've got lines, they have graduation. We use these for measuring out specific volumes of liquid, but then we transfer them to our beaker or test tube to then have our reaction. Don't ever mix stuff in our graduated cylinders. A couple different sizes of these depending on how much you need to measure out. You'll notice that they have different degrees of graduation. This one is more precise, it's got more lines. This is, however, for larger volumes. If we're mixing up some solutions, we've got our glass stirring rods. Make sure you handle these carefully. They are glass and will break if we were to clip them on the edge of a counter or glassware. The other big piece when we're working with our glass stirring rods, make sure after you use it, you rinse it quick before you lay it down on the table so you don't get chemicals on your table that then could contaminate other substances. Oftentimes, if we're looking at fine precipitates, we will use what's called a spot plate. And this is our spot plate, different wells for putting in our different substances to see if there's a reaction that takes place. This one's probably new for us. This is called an Erlenmeyer flask, often used for filtrations and collecting desiccant liquids as they come off of our reactions. Cool. Glassware, as we're working with glassware, if you had a beaker or a test tube and you had it on a hot surface, we never want to handle glassware that's hot. It's going to look the same color as it normally was unless it's about to melt. And so we have tools specifically designed to grab our different substances if they are changing in temperature. For our test tube, we have what's called our test tube clamps, test tube tongs. These are spring-loaded. They will naturally want to close in onto that test tube to hold it in place. If you are conducting an experiment, always put the test tube clamp as high up on the test tube as possible, then hold it from the back end, so that way if something were to happen and you get excited and you squeeze, you don't drop it. If you squeeze or hold it side to side and say a reaction occurs and you have a little bit of excitement and you squeeze, all of a sudden you're going to drop that test tube. No bueno, don't want that, because then you've got broken glass you have to deal with. Same for our beakers. If you've got a hot beaker, you got what's called our beaker tongs. These are actually vulcanized rubber to aid in the gripping of our glassware. These are designed to nestle right around that beaker so that you've got a fairly firm grip on that beaker. Again, hold it up towards the top and then make sure you're being careful. Biggest concern or mistake, biggest misconception are our two tongs here. Sorry, let me clear my view here. We've got two different tongs. One you'll notice has got the rubberized tip. The other one does not. These are two different sets of tongs used for different things. This is used for beakers on hot plates. This is used if we're working with our Bunsen burners. This is called a crucible tong. Crucible, and that you'll notice on the tip here, we've actually got quite a bit of charring and reactive material that's been kind of soot and whatnot. Because this is designed to actually go into the fire. This one is not. If you put this into the fire, you'll actually melt and or burn the rubber on the end of your beaker tongs. Other two tools that we're going to use pretty frequently in the lab setting, we've got our forceps, aka tweezers. You're probably familiar with those over the course of your years. The other one, which is kind of fun, it's called a scoopula. Scoopula because it is used for scooping. We scoop up our solids with these. Between our variety of different tongs and our forceps, there is no reason you should ever have to touch a chemical in the lab. Just another added layer of protection between you and your materials, such that we know we've got an extra little gap between us and our reaction. The other kind of piece worth mentioning when we're working with our test tubes, oftentimes we'll use what's called a test tube rack. This test tube rack is plastic. The biggest mistake folks will do is they'll heat up a test tube with our test tube tongs, and then they'll put it right back into the rack. Well, if your glass is hot, you will melt that plastic. Just be conscientious. If you need to let your test tube cool, we just lay it on the table to cool until it is ready to be put away. Cool, just some of the big common glassware and equipment that we're going to be using in the lab. Obviously, there'll be other kind of rarer pieces we might use from time to time, but this should get us through the bulk of our chemistry career.